Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see all of you this morning. We're going to continue with the 18th International Conference with an amazing session to start out on special agents. And this session will feature two remarkable figures of World War II espionage that are really navigating the murky world of wartime Europe. And Clare Mulley, Bradley Hart will uncover that hidden world by featuring two remarkable figures of the Second World War. Clare is going to talk about Agent Zoe, the only woman to serve as a courier in Poland's underground army and the SOE. We got a little hint of that yesterday. And Bradley is going to share the story of Baron Edgar von Spiegel, a German diplomat and spy. Now, chairing the session, we're joined by Dr. Leah Garrett. Had a wonderful conversation yesterday to close out the symposium. She's the author of 5 highly acclaimed books of history and literature, holds a PhD from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, and is the director of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at Hunter College, the City University of New York. And of course, the author of the critically acclaimed X Troop, as we heard about yesterday. So I'm going to turn it over to this cast and go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for attending this extraordinary conference. I'm going to very briefly introduce our speakers because there's more information in the booklets, and then they will each speak for about 20 minutes. I'll ask them a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up for the audience. So Clare Mulley is an award-winning historian, author, and broadcaster who's shed a very important light on the history of women during World War II. She's written multiple books, including The Spy Who Loved, The Secrets and Lives of Christine Granville, Britain's first female special agent of World War II, and her most recent book, Agent Zoe, The Untold Story of World War II. And I'm also going to introduce Bradley Hart, who's the senior historian at the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. And he wrote a very important book called Hitler's American Friends, The Third Reich's Supporters in the United States.
Thank you. I should have some slides. Yeah. Thanks. Maybe I'll do this. It's not. Well, thank you very much. Oh, well done, Leah. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me back after yesterday. I can't have done too badly. Thank you. So I am here to talk about Agent Zoe, my latest book. Here's the American cover. So who was Zoe? Zoe was the only person during the Second World War to parachute from Britain to Nazi German-occupied Poland while wearing a dress, because she was the only woman to parachute in that direction. And of course, on top of that dress, well, that dress had military value because she had to disappear into the clandestine resistance as quickly as possible, and most women were not wearing trousers at that point in Poland. But on top of the dress, she was wearing a tightly knitted cardigan. It was September 1943, already cold in Eastern Europe. She had an old overcoat of Polish make. On top of that, she had her parachute drop chute, which had a belt full of gold coins to give to the resistance. She had a spade, a torch, searchlight, and she had a little tiny, she had 2 revolvers, of which she was very proud, and she had a little tiny thing as well. She had a cyanide pill, a poison pill, sewn into one of her hems in case it all went terribly wrong. Now, I'm afraid in the just 20 minutes that I've got, it's impossible for me to tell you all of her missions and her achievements. What I'm going to try and do is give a flavor of her character and explain why she's such an important figure. She was actually one of the very first women to serve in the Second World War. She was sleeping on an airbase on the 1st of September 1939, and she was shaken awake by a series of explosions at 5 o'clock in the morning, and she immediately leapt up and stepped into action. She had orders in the eventuality of an invasion to immediately step into action. And so she just flipped on the Polish radio to make sure this was an invasion and not Allied tests or something. And she heard a radio broadcast, an emergency, letting the Polish people know that this was what we now call the Blitzkrieg, the start of the Second World War, with German troops invading Allied, in this case, Polish territory. And the last words on that radio program told the Polish people, as of now, we are all soldiers. And Zoe took that very much to heart. Here she is. She's the lady in the middle. She's appropriate. She's always in the middle of danger, of trouble, in the middle of action. And you can see she's already in uniform. This is the Polish Women's Military Auxiliary. They're not officially part of the Polish Armed Forces because women in the Polish Armed Forces, as with the Brits and Americans, were not allowed to bear arms. So they're with a very highly trained, independent military auxiliary. So she's got all the training that she needs. And her first role was to go to a city called Lvov, to coordinate the defense. That city is now called Lviv in Ukraine, and it's once again under attack. So she went to Lvov, and she was involved in setting up anti-aircraft, machine gun nests, providing the shells and ammunition supplies, and then working in a factory to create what we call Molotov cocktails, petrol bombs, which were the most effective homemade weapons to throw against invading enemy tanks. So quickly, a map. I do love a map. Poland is invaded on the 1st of September from the west by Germany. You can see the swastika arrows coming in. But just 17 days later, they are invaded for a second time from the east, from the Soviet Union, the Red Army. And Stalin said they were just coming in to protect the ethnic Russian population in that part of Polish territory. No more comment needed, I think. But in fact, we now know that there was an agreement between the Germans and the Poles under the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. There was a secret protocol always saying they would divide up the country down that black dotted line that I put on that map there. And so Poland now knew they couldn't continue to fight on effectively on two fronts. They never capitulated, unlike many countries. They kept fighting on, but they decided to evacuate their armed forces, their treasury, and their government. And in fact, some key people, like the Polish Enigma decoders, the first people to break the Enigma code, with whom Zoe had studied maths at university, she knew them. So they got their armed forces, 35,000 troops, out through Lvov, the city that Zoe is defending. So you can see she's right at the center of the action. She could have left with them. A lot of Polish women did. They served as clerks and secretaries and as drivers, sometimes under fire, such as at Monte Cassino in Italy later, where the Poles played a key role. But Zoe decided to stay and help organize the fledgling Polish resistance. So why was she so determined? Here she is, again. She's actually the baby in her big sister's arms at the back of this photograph. She was born in 1909. She was the 7th of 8 children in her family. And she used to say that she sucked in patriotism with her mother's milk. I love that imagery. She was born in a traditional, beautiful garrison town called Toruń in northwestern Poland. But when she was born in 1909, that part of Poland had been annexed into the Prussian Empire, an earlier German empire. Poland has this history of centuries of being invaded, occupied, and annexed off, but also centuries of defiance, resistance, and liberation. So when she was born, that city was part of the Prussian Empire, so legally, she was actually German. What an irony. And the Prussians were very keen to suppress any Polish culture and heritage in that area. So Polish language was suppressed. Her first language was German. Even her name. At home, her parents made damn sure she knew she was Polish. And she was called Elżbieta, which is Elizabeth. But in public, she had to be called Liesel, the German version of Elizabeth. Now, what the Prussians didn't realize, what the Germans didn't realize they're doing, is they are training the perfect woman to serve as an agent against them. They have given her perfect, fluent Polish. They've taught her to have a double identity since she was knee-high. So she is perfectly primed to fight against them. And she's determined to defend the freedom that comes at the end of the First World War for Poland. So here she is. in the war. She immediately after Lwów falls, the Red Army come in and take that part of Poland. She has to hide her uniform, and she serves the rest of the war in civilian clothes like these. And the first thing she does is set up a military intelligence gathering network in Silesia. That's an area about the size of Wales. I should have thought of a state of America, sorry. And she's gathering this information. Within a week, she's recruited 50 people to gather information for her. Within a month, she has 200 people, all organized into cells of 5 for security purposes. And they're a very diverse group of people, but they've all got one thing in common. Of course, they are all women. And this is specifically because women had the skills I was mentioning yesterday. They were not suspected, particularly by the very sexist Nazi regime and personnel, of having the initiative, of having the nous to gather military intelligence, to know what was worthwhile. So she recruited secretaries, translators, even the cleaners who worked in the occupying authorities' offices, who could look at the maps where the pins are going, look at the information on the tables, overhear conversations, women who worked at the post office and telephone exchange, of course, even women who worked in bakeries and laundrettes who could look at the changing garrison bread orders across this massive region, or the different uniforms that are coming in to be washed and mended. And that gives you a really good idea of where troops are going to be next sent. So they gathered all of this information, but none of it was of any use at all unless she could get it to the Home Army head office. The Home Army is the Polish Resistance Armed Forces. And being a courier taking information around is one of the most dangerous roles at this point in Poland. So Zoe, of course, volunteers to do it herself. And amazingly, we still have some of her spy kit. So most of the information she keeps in her head, but she's got changing statistical reports every week. So she writes a little aide-memoire on a slip of paper and slips it down her clothes brush. So you can see the back comes off and could slip back on. And I love the fact that women traveling around Nazi German-occupied Poland on train or on bikes, it wasn't considered unusual. They carried a clothes brush, obviously much better dressed than me, much neater. Quite soon, they developed microfilming, and this key, you could wind the microfilm around the pin in the center and put that down the shaft of the key. Everyone is carrying house keys with them. Very hard for them to stop and search everybody's keys the whole time. Nonetheless, it is incredibly dangerous. Very soon they have developed forged papers, which Zoe makes good use of. Here are just some of her ID photographs used through the war. And you can see, first one in uniform, the rest of them, she's changing her appearance, different haircut, different clothes, glasses on, off, and so on. She's taking different identities to be as safe as possible. And in this last photograph with the spotty shirt, that's from 1940, late 41, and she's traveling as a German oil company secretary, Elisabeth Kubitzer. Oil was a war-important industry. Women were working as secretaries in those roles, so that gave a reason for why she could be traveling around. And this is because by late 1941 and through 42, she is serving as their most senior courier, bringing information not just into Warsaw, but from Warsaw right into the heart of Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich, which seems insane, the most perilous route she could do. Why? Because they have a friendly contact at an embassy there who is putting her information into the diplomatic post and getting it to London. After the fall of France, that's where the Polish government in exile set up, and that, of course, is where the British allies are based. And so this is the fastest way to get military information to London to share with the rest of the allies. So she's going in and out of Berlin. I just want to give you an example of the danger she's facing. She goes in on her last trip because it goes terribly wrong, and she hands over her microfilm at the embassy, and they give her a wad of American dollar bill notes to take back to Warsaw to fund the resistance, to pay for bribes, to pay for weapons, and so on. And she thinks this is pretty dangerous to carry, and she's nearly been caught with a wad of money previously, but managed to escape. I don't have time for all the stories. She thinks this time she's going to be more cautious. So instead of going straight back, she goes to a friend, she takes a risk, goes to a friend in Berlin, and the two of them stay up all night, pasting these dollar bills inside the lid of her battered old suitcase. And then she sews the lining up over the top of it so they can't be seen. She thinks this is the safest way to smuggle this large amount of money. As soon as she's done that, she's one day late, but she throws her few clothes and things into that suitcase and off she goes. And she always varies her route, so she's harder to trace. And this time she was due to spend the night before, as soon as she crossed into Polish territory, with her younger sister, Clara. So she goes to Clara's a day late. They've got a little system where she throws a pebble up to a side window. Clara twitches the curtain. She knows all is okay. So Zoe throws the pebble up. Nothing happens. And she knows immediately something's wrong. There's actually been a betrayal. So she, instead of calling at Clara's flat, she goes to a neighbor, bangs on the door, and they open the door just a crack, and they hiss at her, "Go! Clara's been arrested. The Gestapo are waiting for you in her apartment." So Zoe had this appalling moment of knowing there's nothing she can do to help her sister. She just has to turn on her heels and try and save the money, save the information that she has. So off she goes, and she actually spends a day. She could have just disappeared immediately, gone to a safe house, but she risks everything to go to the train station to warn the people in the resistance coming in the morning, for which she is given a high honor from Poland. So she manages to issue a few warnings, and then she catches a train to Krakow. I can't do the whole story, but she is then followed, and she realizes the Gestapo are tailing her. And eventually she thinks she's shaken them off, and she takes the last night train from Warsaw up to from Krakow to Warsaw. It would have been an old steam train like this. That's her, of course. And then while she's sitting in the carriage, she thinks she's okay, the door opens, and a man she recognizes, clearly the man who's been following her, gets on and sits down opposite her in the train carriage. What is she going to do? She thinks, I'll have to kill myself. The only reason he probably hasn't caught me already is because he's waiting to see if anyone meets me. And when I get to Warsaw, probably other members of the resistance will come and welcome me. So she waits. She doesn't really want to die. She waits until the middle of the night. He seems to be asleep. And she slipped off her shoes and quietly opened the carriage door and padded down the corridor. She looked back and she saw his face lean round. He was still watching her. She looked out the window. This is an express train travelling through the night. It's not going to slow down. There's no other stops. And she just sees telegraph poles whizzing past the windows. So she just walks on towards the toilet compartment. And when she gets to the passenger door, she just takes her life in her hands, opened the door, and threw herself out from the moving train. It's just one occasion. She's a hair's breadth from being caught by the Gestapo. One of the things I love about her is she's got a great sense of humor. Later, she told her friend, because she does survive, she told her friend that in moments of mortal peril like this, I thought of my childhood books that I loved just to give me some comfort as I'm going. And she said she loved cowboy and Indian books, the American Wild West. And she said these chaps, she remembered, they like to jump up in the air to kind of slow down their momentum. So she said, I pretended I was coming off a horse and I jumped into the air. She said, I just fell down really hard. But she hadn't smashed her head open, she hadn't been caught by the Gestapo, and she hadn't betrayed her colleagues. So that's just one example. After that, she knew she was burnt on that route. Her name and her face are now known. But she knows she's got a lot of experience, and the commander of the Polish Home Army thinks we can still make use of her. So at this point, she becomes the only woman to be an emissary of the commander of an Allied army. So an emissary is the personal representative of an Allied army commander. And she is appointed to go all the way from Warsaw with 2 vital microfilm and 2 orders to undertake in London over nearly 1,000 miles of enemy-occupied territory. I said I loved a map. This is her route. She starts in Warsaw. The first place she has to go to is back to Berlin. Now, that is the route she is known on, the most dangerous section, but it's the fastest way, and this is time-sensitive information. So she manages to get through Berlin, gets to Strasbourg. I can't do all the stories. She's caught in an Allied air raid in Strasbourg, but she makes it, gets across the border to Paris in northern occupied France. I'll do the Paris story. She arrives in Paris. She's again traveling on very well-forged papers as a German oil company secretary. And as a German worker, she has to report at the Reich Ministry in Paris for all German workers coming into the territory. So she waits till the evening, hoping that they will be a bit more cursory in the way they give a check to her papers, and she hands over her papers. And they take them and they say, there's just something about these papers. I don't know what it is. They look right, but just something a bit different. She's going, well, okay. And they say, but it's late and we want to get going. And then they say, you get a room in that hotel and we'll have a proper look in the morning. So she has to go and wait in this hotel. Apparently, I don't think she slept much because she told a friend of hers exactly what the wallpaper looked like. It's quite a nice little detail to put in the book. She must have been pacing that room. And in the morning, she just steeled herself and had to go back to the bureau. And they said, yeah, we recognize you. Can you come around the side, please? So she went round. They said, are these your papers? She said, yes. They said, here you are, they're such good quality. We wanted to keep them, to compare them against these possible forgeries over here, but thank you. So she couldn't show any relief, of course. She just had to take them and off she went. So that's a kind of example. She gets to Paris. She has to get across, you see the white line into southern Vichy, France. That's the demarcation line. Again, she hides on a train. She has a terrible time with trains in the war. She hides in the water tender of the collaborationist Prime Minister of France's personal train, knowing there'll be less checks on his train. And she thinks, oh, no one will think of hiding in the water tender, you know, the big steel tank that carries the water to make the steam. So she goes in the middle of the night, climbs into this tank, and she meets 7 members of the French resistance already hiding in there. Anyhow, they're nearly drowned when they fill up with more water, but they make it. Eventually she gets through France. I can't do it all. She gets to Tarascon, a little town up in the Pyrenees on the French side, and she pays a guide to take her across the Pyrenees mountains. They are actually shot at in the freezing border passes, but eventually she gets to Gibraltar, hitches a ride on a troop ship, and she gets to London on May Day, in fact. She gets to Liverpool on May Day 1943. Here she is in the London, all her papers are now in the London archive because of the work she undertook there. So she's got this 2 microfilm, that's incredibly important information, and she is interrogated in a rather nicer way. The interrogation port, she's given a cup of tea. It's not like German interrogation. The SOE are so impressed with the level of information she's brought so quickly that they propose her for the OBE, a very high British honour. She's got 2 missions to undertake in Britain. The first one involves this rather handsome chap. This is Kazimierz Bielski. His code name, he named himself after one of his favourite things. His code name is Rum. He is a fantastic man. I do love him. He is organising the London end of the land courier routes. Zoe is involved in organising the Polish end. Now, obviously, they send as much information as possible by radio, but you can't send anything too sensitive in case it's overheard. You can't send maps. You can't send documents. So that's what they're sending on this land courier route. But there's loads of problems and delays at the London end, so Zoe's been told to sort it out. And Rum, he's a man of his era. You know, when she arrives, he didn't realise Zoe was going to be a woman. He doesn't know whether to salute her or bow and kiss her hand. He doesn't like being ordered around by a woman. And he thinks perhaps the best way to deal with this is to flirt with her. So one morning, about a week after she's arrived, they're walking through St James's Park in London. There's bluebells and birdsong, and I presume some American GIs making out with our girls on the lawns there. And he thinks this is the right moment. And so he suddenly reaches into his pocket and he pulls out some silk stockings and flourishes them, sort of like an amorous magician. And she is, well, he says her response was shocking. She's appalled. The only women in Nazi German-occupied Poland wearing silk stockings are the mistresses of the Gestapo. You can't get them. You can't get enough food. They are starving to death. All of her family have now been arrested by the Germans. Some of them do survive, thank goodness. And she realizes what the problem is that Rum has no idea what conditions are like in occupied territory. He is a brilliant military officer, but he got out during the campaign. He went out through France, he served again in France, he's serving again in Britain, but he hasn't experienced occupation. And so that is what the problem is. They think conditions are rather like the ones in London. And on a Friday, they clock off at 5 and they start work again on Monday at 9. That's not how it works in the resistance in war. And so they sort it out between them and they make huge improvements. Her second mission is to secure the legal military status of women as soldiers in the Polish Home Army. Unfortunately, by the time she arrives in London, the commander of the Polish Home Army has been betrayed and arrested. And nobody believes that this is his command in London. And she's got the papers, but they just can't get their head around it, neither the Brits nor the Poles in London. And, the commander hasn't done that. He's not an equal rights employee. He's not a progressive. He knows that not having military status means that the women can't have rank. They can be more experienced than some of the men who perhaps escaped down pilots or escaped prisoners of war, but they can't discipline the men. It causes problems with security and recruitment because the women can't be paid, so they can't support their families, so they can't serve as much as they would like to. There's loads of issues, there's inefficiencies. So that's why he wants it. It's military reality. But no one believes her, and the files are full of papers like this one saying, Elizabeth, as you know, is inclined to take the militant female dictator view of things. So they say absolutely not. She doesn't take no for an answer, and she writes the military legal decree herself. No one signs it yet, but it will save many thousands of lives. So from there, they say, thank you very much. You've been brilliant. Where would you, we'll get you a flat. Where do you want to spend the rest of the war? She's like, what are you talking about? I'm going to go back, serve my country. They say, well, you can't, I'm afraid, because, you're a lady. You can't, the only way to go back is parachuting. So she becomes the only woman to get her parachute wings from Poland, and she is parachuted back on a very perilous Halifax 4-engine bomber flight back to occupied Poland, where very quickly she takes place. She serves in the Warsaw Uprising. This is her uniform, and she played a key role. And at the end of the Warsaw Uprising, when they are finally forced to capitulate, partly by Russian betrayal, she manages to get the new commander to sign the decree making women soldiers in law, which means in the only time in history, the only time in the Second World War, Nazi Germany set up prisoner of war camps for women. There were so many who served, 12,000 in the uprising alone, that they had to set up 2 prisoner of war camps for women, saving the lives of around 10,000 women. Extraordinary work. So she is demobilized as one of Poland's most highly decorated women. These are just some of her medals, but she didn't see any of them for another 40 years, because when we are celebrating peace and freedom, Poland is left with a Soviet-imposed communist regime. And the great irony of Zoe's story is she is a hair's breadth. She serves from the very first minute of the war right to the end, constantly just manages to evade capture by Nazi German forces. At the end of the war, she is arrested by the communist Polish government. She is sentenced to 10 years in prison on trumped-up charges. And she is tortured for names of her colleagues, but she never speaks. In the peace. This is the history we need to remember. So I just want to end on a quote from Zoe. She said, in the social consciousness, a soldier of any military organization is a male soldier, and women's participation is perceived as simple, ordinary, and properly unnoticed. Well, I hope this book brings 2 things to greater notice, both the role played by Poland, so important today, we see so much of that resonance today with the current war, but also I hope it helps us to rebalance our view on the effectiveness of the women that served and their contribution to the Allied war effort. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for being here again this morning. That groaning you hear is everyone thinking, oh, we hear from this guy again, after everyone heard from me yesterday. But thank you for joining me this morning. What I'm going to be talking about is a very different story from what Clare Mulley just talked about, and a story that doesn't necessarily have a clear end. It's a story that is an outgrowth of my previous project, Hitler's American Friends. And one of the questions I asked in that book, and I was asking myself as a researcher, that book is all about pro-Nazi groups in the United States. One of the questions is, what was their relationship with the German government itself? And that turns out to be a more complicated question than you initially might think. After the war, many of the people, including the person I'm about to talk about, denied there was any connection at all between groups like the German-American Bund, who just happened to be super pro-Nazi, and the actual Nazi government. And whether or not that's true is still something of an open question. But today I want to introduce you to a man that you have almost assuredly never heard of, the Baron von Spiegel, who, unless you are an enthusiast for World War I U-boat novels or late Weimar Republic films about U-boat novels, you probably have not yet heard of him. So let's meet the Baron von Spiegel and talk about his role in Nazi espionage. His full name is Edgar von Spiegel von und zu Peckelsheim. Doesn't get much more German than that, I suspect. The Baron von Spiegel is, this is a double-barreled last name, as they say. He's the descendant of 2 Prussian noble families, born in 1885 in what is then East Prussia. And the Baron von Spiegel comes from sort of a naval family. So he actually joins the German Navy prior to World War I as a junior officer. And of course, wartime is good for getting promoted, especially in the German Navy when you go to the unrestricted U-boat campaign. So in 1917, the young Baron von Spiegel, and there he is actually from the frontispiece of the book I'm about to talk about, actually gets promoted to the captain of U-93, So this is in 1917, April of 1917, when the unrestricted U-boat campaign is really gaining steam. This is the period where the Germans are indiscriminately firing on ships that they believe may be supportive of the Allied cause under many different flags, not just necessarily Allied flags. So Baron von Spiegel is apparently quite a successful naval officer. Again, he's risen to captain in just a few years. U-93 is actually an experimental U-boat. It's the latest in U-boat technology, if you will. And according to both the Baron's own account under interrogation later on and the British account, which is based upon more reliable evidence, he sinks more than 10 ships in 2 weeks using U-93. So this is a pretty impressive record, using a combination of the deck guns and torpedoes, apparently mines and things like that. So this is a very impressive reign of terror, actually, in the English Channel. But the Baron von Spiegel's luck runs out at the end of April 1918, again, only about 2.5 weeks at sea, when he approaches a schooner that appears to be in trouble off the coast of England. So he approaches this schooner and actually surfaces the U-boat, and he begins to approach it. Now, one other aspect of the Baron's early career that's interesting is that he is actually a known figure even before what I'm about to describe takes place. He becomes known, actually, as the most compassionate U-boat commander of the war. Because the Baron, apparently, there are stories circulating already in the British press about this commander who, when he fires on a ship, actually does the right thing and surfaces and allows everyone to get off before he actually sinks it. So he's actually being talked about already. So on this particular occasion, the Baron von Spiegel, and he'll also rescue especially British officers and bring them on board his U-boat and drop them off in neutral territories and things like that. So pretty remarkable, supposedly. The Baron von Spiegel, so on this particular occasion, sort of surfaces, fires on this apparently already crippled wooden schooner, and begins to move in for the kill. And he actually sees them sort of strike their colors. A lifeboat descends from the side of the boat and begins to sort of sail away as if they've abandoned ship. And so the Baron believes that he is about to strike and sink his 11th or 12th ship. As he approaches and gets within a few yards of the ship, actually, the structures on the top of the ship collapse to reveal deck guns. It's a British Q ship. So the Q ships were a British tactic late in the war to try to sink U-boats. They would effectively disguise former civilian vessels, or actually, in this case, a captured German vessel, as if they were merchant ships. They would mimic being crippled, and actually part of the crew would get off the ship while there were people manning the guns. And then they would fire on these U-boats and in some cases sink them. So the Baron von Spiegel is taken by surprise, understandably here. The Q ship opens fire. He is actually standing on the sort of conning tower, and the first shell fired by the Q ship smashes into the conning tower and blows him into the water, and actually kills several of his other officers. U-93, actually, they think they've sunk it. It sort of limps away and then disappears underwater. It actually hasn't been sunk yet, but the Baron von Spiegel is blown off, and he's actually rescued, ironically, by this Q ship, which is the HMS Prize. So the captain, according to the Baron, treats him with all of the respect due to an officer, actually returns him to Britain, and the Baron von Spiegel will sit out the rest of the war in a British POW camp. While there, though, he doesn't waste his time. He actually writes a novel called U-202 about his experiences as a U-boat commander. And this actually becomes, very oddly during the war, a best-selling novel written by a German U-boat commander. A best-selling novel not only in Germany, but also in Britain. This is bizarre. So it's actually translated into English later on in the 1920s by the head of British Naval Intelligence, a guy named Sir Barry Domville. Translates this book. So Baron von Spiegel, he cooperates with his British captors. I've actually seen his interrogation documents. He, according to his British interrogators, is a close friend of the Kaiser. So he's seen as a high-value prisoner. He gives limited information about U-boat capabilities. At one point, the British ask him, how many U-boats do you have? And he says, I prefer not to answer. So a good answer if you're a POW in adherence with the Geneva Conventions and things. And he's released at the end of the war. This is actually, again, publicized in the press, even at the time, that they've captured this very high-value target effectively. The Baron goes back to Germany in the interwar period, already a famous author. He actually then writes a series of romance novels in the 1920s, which I have not read, but involving romance in the South Pacific and things like that. And then again, his novel is translated, I think it's 1922, by Barry Domville, becomes a bestseller in both the UK and the US. This is a pretty famous German figure, effectively. Apparently speaks very good English with an English accent, which presumably he had been taught as a child, an aristocratic child, and then refines during his time in British custody. Now this is where the Baron's story turns truly interesting, as if it wasn't interesting enough already. 1933, the year that Adolf Hitler takes power, there was already a film deal that's been made for the novel U-202 based on the Baron's experiences, and actually becomes one of Adolf Hitler's earliest favorite films. It gets made into a movie called Morgenrot, which means the morning red, referring to the red of the rising sun, which obviously has a lot of lure in sort of nautical circles. And the Baron von Spiegel falls into Adolf Hitler's inner circle, effectively. Goebbels and Goering see this as a positive piece of propaganda for the regime. It is a really bad film, I have to be honest with you. You can find it on YouTube. It is not very good, but it is very popular. So this appears to be the Baron's first entrance into sort of the new regime of Nazi Germany. He cultivates a relationship with apparently Hitler's inner circle, which will be suggested by his later activity, and certainly within the diplomatic corps as well. 1937, the Baron von Spiegel is sent here to New Orleans as the consul general at the consulate just about a mile and a half from here on St. Charles Avenue. Now, what's interesting about this is that the Germans have an interesting approach to consular affairs. Traditionally, these are roles that would be held by career diplomats. The Nazis, and this is a fascinating part of my current research project, appoint celebrities into many of these roles. And the Baron von Spiegel is one of these sort of celebrity diplomats. And they also, of course, have careers as intelligence agents as well. So the wider German consular system, of course, goes back to throughout the entirety of German-American diplomatic relations, back to the unification of Germany in 1871. But there's consulates all over the country. It's kind of odd for us today to imagine having a consulate in a city like New Orleans, although the German government still has one here. In this period, it makes a lot of sense for a couple of reasons. Number one, large German community here, of course, going back many, many centuries, actually, but also a major port city. And so part of Baron von Spiegel's above-board activities as the consul general is issuing visas, meeting with the captains of ships docking here at the port of New Orleans, dealing with trade issues and things of that sort. And when the Baron arrives here, he actually uses his celebrity to gain entrance into the highest echelons of New Orleans social life. He actually hosts opulent parties in the garden of the beautiful consulate on St. Charles. He's written up in the social columns. He hangs out at the Deutsches Haus, which is the local sort of German cultural organization here. And he becomes a sort of larger-than-life figure. His little dachshunds, he walks around the French Quarter, right? So the Baron von Spiegel becomes a sort of very popular figure, effectively. And this is all, of course, before the war. So 1937 to 39, the Baron von Spiegel has this sort of larger-than-life personality. He also travels up and down the Gulf Coast in his automobile that he purchases while he's here, because his district extends all the way to Florida and actually all the way to Puerto Rico as well. And so he becomes known for his sort of weekend automobile adventures, again, written up in the local press. It's only after the war that this begins to take on a more sinister tone. So 1939, of course, the invasion of Poland, tensions begin to rise among sort of the American public. Is the U.S. going to intervene in this war? Baron von Spiegel, of course, already established himself as this major sort of cultural and local political figure here in New Orleans, has an opulent and presumably boozy dinner one night where he's invited a reporter from the Times-Picayune. One of the things the Baron tells this reporter, Ledger claims that it's an off-the-record interview, is that Germany will not forget those who have sided against it in the Great World Conflict. The Times-Picayune reporter prints this remark. And this sets off a firestorm that extends between New Orleans all the way to Washington, D.C., and ultimately all the way to Berlin. The Baron is summoned to the State Department to explain his remarks. Is this a threat against the United States? Seems like it is. And he actually gets merely a slap on the wrist, actually, from the Secretary of State. But even the governor of Louisiana is involved. The governor actually sends down state troopers to take, or state police officers, to take a sworn statement from this Times-Picayune reporter. He swears a deposition. This is what the Baron said late one night in the consulate here. So June of 1940, the Baron is now attracting some unwanted attention, let's say. And of course, this attracts the attention of the FBI. We heard last night from Nicholas Reynolds, our excellent keynote speaker, that the state of U.S. counterintelligence in this period is fairly limited, actually. There's disputes, effectively, as to who has authority for policing the U.S. against foreign spies. The FBI thinks it's their job, kind of, sort of. The Navy thinks it's their job, the Office of Naval Intelligence, kind of, sort of, and of course New Orleans is a port city. And the State Department also thinks it has a role in counterintelligence, kind of, sort of. So all three of these organizations descend on the Baron von Spiegel and the German consulate simultaneously. And this is a document I found in the National Archives just a few months ago, actually. This is a Department of Justice / FBI report that's sent to the State Department because the State Department's asking for as much information as they can get. And it is absolutely a fascinating document. It goes on for about 3 pages, and it not only names names, it names places these people hung out here in the city of New Orleans, all of which still exist. So it's absolutely fascinating. So numerous investigations seem to definitely establish the fact the activities of the German consulate in New Orleans under Baron Edgar von Spiegel are of a nature inimical to the best interests of the U.S. Then they go on to enumerate what they think they're up to. A close watch on the attaché, agents, and other employees leads to the conclusion they are probably engaged in laying the predicate for a systemic campaign of sabotage to take effect if and when the U.S. should become involved in the war. He has liaison with agents throughout the southern states and Mexico. And then this is one of my favorite things, skipping down to bullet point 8, possibly through fear of wiretapping, those attached to the German consulate seem to prefer telephoning from a public pay station booth located 2 blocks from the consulate on St. Charles Avenue. I haven't yet found the pay station booth, probably doesn't exist anymore, but all of the bars and restaurants named are still around. Actually, they have different names now, but you can hang out in the same bar as Baron von Spiegel's agents, supposedly. So what the Baron von Spiegel is up to, according to the FBI, is that he's engaged in 2 things. He's engaged in collecting information about the ships sailing down the Mississippi. His primary technique in doing this is holding those cocktail parties I mentioned. So people show up, he gives them a few drinks, and they start mentioning, oh yeah, you know, my cousin's sailing out on this ship heading to Europe next week, right? The Baron has a wireless transmitter, supposedly, in the basement of the consulate on St. Charles Avenue, transmitting this information about shipping going through the Gulf. The other half is revealed after the war is that he has what the local press terms a wrecking crew. And this is the sabotage aspect of it. One of the Baron's favorite hangouts, apparently, is a watchmaker's shop on Magazine Street, about a mile from here. What's going on, according to the FBI, in the back room of this watchmaking shop is they're making timed fuses that can be potentially used on bombs that are planted on ships, especially cotton ships, sailing into the Gulf. Now, whether or not this plot is ever executed, I'm still trying to establish, but the idea, you know, this is a pretty robust surveillance network, so something is certainly going on here. And the other places the Baron hangs out are similarly very plausible as sort of nests of various agents. So this goes on pretty much unabated. The FBI maintains close watch, and after the war, there's actually a Times-Picayune reporter, I think it is, who claims that he himself had been enlisted in this sort of surveillance activity and was told by the FBI not to reveal it too soon, because they were afraid that if the Baron knew he was under this kind of surveillance, he would simply change his approach to setting up his network in New Orleans and the wider area. And oddly enough, there seems to be a French nexus with this as well, that the French consulate was trying to spy on the German consulate just as much as the FBI was. So New Orleans, as a nest of spies and agents, very much the case in the early years of the Second World War. One part of history that we often overlook is that FDR actually takes action against this. So in August of 1941, President Roosevelt orders the expulsion of most of the German consular staffs from across the country. This is well before Pearl Harbor. And this is only, by the way, impacting Germany. It doesn't expel the Japanese consuls or their diplomatic staffs. And so this causes a crisis. Now, FDR does this after months and months of lobbying from the State Department, based largely, it seems, upon the Baron von Spiegel. That the Baron's activities have become so egregious, at least in the perception of the State Department, that the Secretary of State goes to President Roosevelt and says something must be done. There's simply too much espionage going on in these consulates. And again, there's a network of these. The other main one for espionage purposes was in San Francisco. And I'll come back to the San Francisco consulate in a moment here. But August of 1941, Roosevelt orders the closure of the consulates, the expulsion of the consul generals. Fascinating bit of history. The State Department actually takes great steps to adhere to the letter of the law with these closures. So they take all of the furniture from the consulates and lock it away in storage units run by the Swiss, actually. They take the diplomats and put them in West Virginia at a resort and then arrange a diplomatic transfer that actually takes place after the war has started. And they put them up in this sort of luxurious resort and also like wiretap their rooms at the same time, of course, right? So it's kind of interesting. And after the war, there's an immense amount of paperwork. This is the most bureaucratic State Department thing ever. Immense amount of paperwork about what should we do with their property. And they actually give it back to these Nazis. They give it back to these Germans after the war, make them pay for the storage costs at the end. So, you know, a little bit of a bureaucratic wrangling even in the midst of the greatest war in human history. So Pearl Harbor happens. The consul generals have all been expelled at this point. There is still a limited consular staff in Washington, D.C. Incidentally, we actually have diplomatic exchanges with the Nazis during the war. We actually, through Swiss back channels, we're negotiating for the release of Americans, American diplomats or American civilians who have been caught in various parts of Germany or in occupied Europe, in exchange for people we are either expelling from the United States, people who have German citizenship who are being expelled for various reasons, or for German diplomats. This actually takes place throughout the war on these sort of neutral ships that are flagged with crosses on the side so they won't be sunk. So the Baron von Spiegel essentially disappears from the United States. But after the U.S. enters the war, many of you will know, the war comes home to the Gulf pretty quickly. There are more than 50 ships sunk in the Gulf following Pearl Harbor up through 1943. This is a pretty intense bit of combat, and there's hundreds of ships sunk off the coast of the United States, a story that we often don't think about. So the U-boat war very quickly comes home. And rumors begin to circulate here in the Gulf area that the Baron von Spiegel has returned. U-boat commander in World War I, remember all those trips he made up and down the coast? He knows the Gulf Coast better than anybody else. Oh, and also he had a passion for photography, apparently. So the rumor begins to surface that the Baron has returned to exact revenge upon the city of New Orleans and the United States government itself. This is a quote from the Tampa Tribune. These stories begin to circulate, by the way, because apparently just outside the mouth of the Mississippi, there is I think it's an oil tanker that is attacked by a U-boat. The U-boat surfaces, people are getting off this tanker, and apparently in perfect English, the U-boat commander says, "Oh, sorry about that, hope you make it home safe." And the crew does. Doesn't this sound like the Baron von Spiegel in World War I? So these rumors begin to circulate. This is a great article. Baron von Spiegel is boss of German U-boats in the Gulf, is the headline, Tampa Tribune. Recently, a man who knows and hates him suggested the Navy might get on his trail and sink him. For, as he added, quote, von Spiegel is the sort who would want to do something drastic in the Gulf to get back at those who tried to run him out of the United States long before the U.S. got in the war. So these rumors begin to spread. My favorite aspect of this is that in I think it's the same issue, actually, of the Tampa Tribune, a reader contributed a little ditty that they had constructed about the Baron. And it goes something like, "The glamorous gangster Baron von Spiegel is just another gangster to the American eagle." I assume not an award-winning poem, but still an indication of how interesting or how interested the American public is in the fate of Baron von Spiegel. Well, as it turns out, the Baron has not returned to exact revenge on American shipping in the Gulf. He has actually been sent to Marseille. So in 1941, following an exchange via neutral Lisbon, the Baron von Spiegel is actually attached to the German consulate in Marseille, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Marseille is a very similar city to New Orleans in a lot of ways, largely French-influenced city, in fact, in France, of course, but an important shipping center. So the Baron von Spiegel, and this is where the story gets a little bit murkier, is attached to he's the German consul general, actually, in Marseille, seems to become attached at some point to the SS, whether or not that's a rank bestowed upon him by the SS against his will to try to keep control of him, or whether he had been involved with the SS previously, not yet clear to me. Of course, Marseille becomes a center of not only mass deportations of the city's Jewish population, it's largely destroyed during the war. And so the Baron's activities in Marseille are a bit opaque. And at the end of the war, after Operation Dragoon, Marseille is captured, and the Baron again sort of disappears for a period of time. Turns out he is captured initially by the French resistance. Yay for him! I'm sure that was a lovely experience. The French resistance, capturing the German consul general, and then he's handed over to the British and handed over to the Americans. And he actually shows up in a number of Nuremberg trials later on. He actually appears to have given evidence involving French collaborationists. He has not tried at Nuremberg for any types of war crimes. He's never tried actually for anything. And I can find no record, in fact, of him being interrogated at Nuremberg at all, as some of the other consul generals are. And this article appears in the Shreveport Journal in December of 1945, reflecting upon this mystery. The Baron still exists in the local memory here, which is somewhat fascinating when you think that this is the end of the war. And it says, while not comparable to the mystery surrounding the disappearance of Adolf Hitler, this is still the period where there's dispute over what's happened to Hitler. Of course, we know he's committed suicide, but there's still dispute over the disappearance of his remains into Soviet hands and things, whose death has been reported but never proved. Considerable curiosity in this country and in Germany as to the whereabouts of Baron Edgar von Spiegel, once German consul at New Orleans and later attached to the Nazi intelligence department. That does seem to be true. When Allied forces broke through in the south of France in late 1944, it was reported von Spiegel had been captured by the French, sent to a concentration camp. Following VE Day, reported by the Associated Press that he was being detained for questioning by the Allied Control Commission, interrogating POWs, and so far as we recall, never anything printed about his release or escape from custody. And so there's speculation as to what's happened to this man. And his story, again, becomes a little bit opaque here. He dies in Bremen, another naval city, in 1965. So he survives well into the post-war period, never really writes anything further that I can find about his experiences. He presumably was denazified, though I can't find evidence of his denazification record. And I return to the question, and I'll shamelessly promote our podcast again, because these are the types of questions that we're dealing with here. Who was the Baron von Spiegel working for? Was he working for the German government? Obviously true, but think back to his story in that POW camp in 1917, right? Again, answers all of his interrogators' questions very willingly, as he seems to have after the Second World War as well. Book is translated by the head of British Naval Intelligence in the 1920s, and interestingly, Barry Domville himself will be interned for his pro-Nazi sympathies later on, which complicates the story even more. Baron von Spiegel obviously very heavily surveilled by the US government and appears to have run some sort of intelligence network out of here in New Orleans, which would make perfect sense. But in fact, how does the Baron von Spiegel get himself off the hook? Ultimately, is this a story of a man who not only operates as an intelligence operative in some senses, but also plays a role in sort of securing the status of fellow intelligence officers like himself? And incidentally, in closing, the Consul General in San Francisco, we can talk about this more in the Q&A if you want, is Hitler's former commanding officer in World War I. It's a man named Fritz Wiedemann. Fritz Wiedemann turned state's evidence at Nuremberg and saves his own skin. And very similar to Baron von Spiegel, dies essentially anonymously in the 1960s, having essentially given up the Nazi intelligence networks over to the Allies at the end of the war. And so is this a story of potentially someone, again, who has essentially made a contribution to both sides of the war? So that being said, very happy to take your questions, and thank you again for being here this morning.
Wonderful papers. It was very interesting to hear about agents, so that this young woman on the right side of history could have such a profound impact on the war. And it was also wonderfully interesting to hear about the Baron and his ties to New Orleans, which was a story I'd never heard about before. So I'm going to ask a couple of broad questions to both of the speakers, and then we'll open it up to the audience. My first question is my curiosity from both of you about how you discovered these incredibly interesting figures and decided to write about them.
Shall I kick off?
Please.
Claire.
So, as I think people know, I've written a few books before. I'd written a book called The Spy Who Loved, and it's about a Polish-born countess who served the British. And when that book came out, I was very honoured, literally honoured by the Polish government. They gave me a cultural award, a medal. It's really lovely. I never know when to wear it, in bed, obviously, every night. Anyhow, so I had to go to the Polish embassy to receive it. And when I arrived, there was me and there were 4 quite tall chaps who were also getting awarded. And at the back, there was a little elderly lady sitting on her own. So obviously, I made a beeline for her. I said, "Oh, are you with one of these gentlemen? What brings you?" And she said, "No, dear, I'm a veteran of the Second World War, so they always invite me." And she said, "The wine here is very good, so I always come." And I knew I really liked her immediately. So I asked about her service, and she, just very briefly, she was a 16-year-old. She served in the Warsaw Uprising and knew Zov in that time. As a 16-year-old, I mean, she didn't have a gun in hand. Some did, but she was going out to get medical supplies across the city. And she said one day she managed to get to the university and she found 10 glass bottles full of methylated spirits, which could be used as antiseptic. So she was running back. She put them in her rucksack, was running back to the field hospitals, which are in cellars and basements, to give them some protection. And she was caught in an incendiary bombing raid and a fire bombing raid. And she just ran faster. And suddenly she felt something smash into her back, shrapnel, really hard. But she was luckily protected by these glass bottles, just one of them broke. And then she kept running, and she said she had this strange sensation of suddenly feeling freezing in a burning street because the meths had soaked through the bag and her shirt and was evaporating off her back. And she looked me straight in the eye and she said, "I knew then that I was going to die because I was a petrol bomb." But she just kept running, and she made it back to the field hospital, and all they said was, "You've broken one of these." That's what conditions were like. And so I felt really humble. She said, what are you doing here? And I said, "Oh, not a veteran, I've never served, but I just wrote this book about Christina Scarbeck, wonderful agent. She said, oh yes, she was fantastic, Scarbeck. For goodness sake though, why didn't you write about the real hero? Why didn't you write about Zoe? And that was the first time I heard her name. So that lady's story is in the book. Many stories are woven through it, and it was a real honor to then find out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I've not gotten any medals, so I can't claim that. But yeah, as I mentioned, I mean, this is kind of an outgrowth of my book on Nazi sympathizers in the U.S. and this question of, what was the real role of Nazi intelligence in the U.S. For decades, many historians had sort of assumed that the so-called Brown Scare, this idea that there are Nazis all over the U.S., Nazi agents everywhere, that it was merely that. It was just a scare, exacerbated by Hollywood and sort of post-war memories and things like that. It's not really true. There were Nazi agents all over the U.S., and what's fascinating is a little bit of that has been written about, the sort of Nazi spy rings type thing, but the diplomatic side of it really hasn't. And the consulates were incredibly important because they're operating under diplomatic cover. The State Department doesn't really know what to do with them. And so for every consulate, I think there's 8 or 9 of them across the US in this period, they all have this sort of similar level of sort of espionage nexus, seemingly. And I'll give you a good example, or an example of why I find this story so interesting. I was in the National Archives at College Park flipping through the State Department decimal files, they're called, which is literally just the State Department's central file. And I found this, this is mostly a paper archive, but I had this piece of cloth. It was right in the middle of a file. And so I'm flipping through, reading about, the Baron von Spiegel documents similar to what I showed you earlier. And I open up this sort of cloth pouch, and it's the German diplomatic pouch. And it actually is the German diplomatic pouch sent from Tokyo to New Orleans. And it had been sent to the State Department because at customs here in New Orleans, they'd actually broken the seals on it and opened it and found Nazi propaganda inside. And so the State Department seizes it, and the Germans, Baron von Spiegel himself, took this and sent it to the State Department in protest of them taking their Nazi propaganda from them. So when you see objects like that, I mean, that's what fascinates me about these stories, the physicality of it, and especially living here in New Orleans, this stuff all happened a mile from here. Right, you can walk past the watchmaker shop I mentioned, or walk past the bar that Baron von Spiegel met his agents in, and that to me is what makes history real in that sense. It's that local aspect, and this is again true in communities all over the country.
Thank you. And I'll ask one more question. I'm curious about the sort of research process. I'm assuming you had to probably work with Polish documents, you had to work with German documents, or were you able to use British archives? How did that process work to uncover both of these untold stories? Claire?
All of those.
Right.
All of those things. I spent a lot of time in Poland, did 3 trips to Poland. It's a bit closer for me from England. I had incredible interviews. I interviewed a woman who shared her prison cell. I interviewed President Lech Wałęsa. Lech Wałęsa, because Zoe kept fighting, and she was actually involved in supporting Solidarity to finally bring freedom to her nation.
Right.
And at that point, Lech Wałęsa, the first democratically elected president of Poland, presented her with the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest award. But he said she wasn't that bothered. She got a lot of badges by then, And then he realized what she'd really appreciate, and he promoted her from captain to brigadier general, retired, only the 2nd female general in Polish history. So that really meant a lot to her. But I also interviewed a guy, in fact, Lech Wałęsa's press secretary, who had recorded interviews with her in the 1980s, when Poland was still under the communist regime. And it was considered seditious. He wasn't allowed to interview people like her. And you weren't even allowed to have blank tapes in Poland to record on. But he had found, he put on this tape in a tape deck and played this interview, and I could hear her striking the table with her as she talked about her movements and laughing. She was fantastic. And then the tape came to an end, and this martial music blared out. And so I had to say, Andrea, I'm sorry, I didn't think you were a marching band kind of guy. What's the music? And he said, because it was illegal to have blank tapes, he found you could put a bit of sellotape over the tab and record your music on top. He had put sellotape over the tab of the highest quality tapes that would last best, and they were the tapes of the communist regime. So he had literally recorded the testimony of a freedom fighter over the propaganda of the regime, which ended in martial music. It was just perfect.
Amazing.
He gave me 27 tapes, so that was good.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, all of the above as well. I think part of this story when you're dealing with spies and espionage is you have to get a variety of sources. So some of the material I use is personal material relating to these people, or personal material relating to people who knew them as well. Official archives, obviously State Department, the German archives. Fortunately, much of the German archive was microfilmed at the end of the war by the Allies, so it's available both here and in Britain. But I think as well, interestingly, Baron von Spiegel has an oral history with the Imperial War Museum, where he only talks about World War I. So I wonder what's in the rest of that. But I don't know why they would have not asked about anything in World War II. There might be good reasons for that. But I think this is all about a variety of materials. The other archive I'd mention is the OSS archive. Has radio intercepts, and the British, actually, GCHQ, has radio intercepts for not only the Germans, but also for the United States in the 1930s and 40s. And so we can actually see the traffic that the British were intercepting and get a sense of what's going on with these wider networks. And the British, incidentally, also intercepted Gestapo traffic. So there's direct intercepts of Gestapo stations in places like Mexico talking about their agents. Of course, you have to decipher the code names and things like that, but it's super helpful.
Amazing, thank you, so interesting. So we will now open it up for questions.
Great, round of applause for our wonderful morning panel.
So good.
Please raise your hands, and Connie and I will come to you. We'll start with Connie to your left, towards the back, please.
This question's for Bradley. Maybe we can discuss this at the Baron's Bar later. Was there any connection between German consulates, spy rings, all that, and the, I should say, established connections with the groups like the No Foreign Wars Committee, the America First Committee, Charles Lindbergh, all of them?
That is a great question. I mean, that's kind of the big research question historians have been trying to piece together ever since the 1940s. Of course, the America First Committee, No Foreign Wars Committee denied that there's any connection at all. As far as we can tell, there's not much of a formal one. There are agents of influence, many of whom get indicted under violations of the Foreign Agents Registration Act later on, who are operating using German money, supporting those groups either by speaking there or possibly financial support as well. And that's the question with groups like the German-American Bund, too. Fritz Wiedemann in San Francisco, who I mentioned, the consul general there, Hitler's former captain in World War I, when he testifies at Nuremberg, they ask him this question. He says, I didn't give them any money, but my predecessor did. Now, this would be the Bund in the pre-America First Committee era. So I think we don't really know the answer. We probably never will. There's certainly German agents who are involved with those groups, without doubt. But would someone like Charles Lindbergh have known that? Probably not. I think Lindbergh, we can talk about Lindbergh for hours and hours, fascinating guy. But I think if Lindbergh had known there were actual Nazi agents in there, he would have been deeply uncomfortable with it. That was kind of the red line for him. Thanks for the question.
Next question's all the way to your right, towards the front.
This is for Claire. I apologize if you explained this, but how long did the trip take for Zoe to get from Europe all the way to Liverpool? And by the time she got there, was the information still timely, and was it used?
Yeah, it's a good question. It took longer than she wanted. She set out, she actually had to return from Paris because there was a betrayal and some issues, it's all in the book, had to return, but that worked out quite well because they updated the information. So these two microfilms she got, one of them was largely military information. It included some troop movements, and some of that information was dated, but it also included other information that was still very relevant, like key industrial targets to take out in strikes and so on. So most of that value was still kept. But the second microfilm was rather different. It contained not the first, but still early information on the Holocaust. So the emissary before her was a man called Jan Karski. He brought out the first eyewitness testimony of the Holocaust. He thought he'd been in a camp. He'd actually only been in a transit camp, but that was so bad, he assumed that was one of the final camps. And she brought out the second, and then she worked with Jan Karski in London. So that was information on the ghettos, on Auschwitz itself, which of course is in Nazi German-occupied Polish territory, but also the greater network of the Holocaust, and that became very vital. So yeah, thank you.
Next question's with Connie to your left, towards the back, please.
Thank you for two great presentations. My question is for Brad. In the interwar period, there was, of course, the Army, the Navy, FBI, and state all wanting bits of the intel business. There was another claim at the FCC in the signals intelligence business. Yeah. Is there anything reflecting their activities or their success in the illicit broadcast problem? Yeah,
that's a great question. So yeah, the FCC is the other counterintelligence player we often don't think about, right? Because they have authority over radio transmissions. Yes, you'll see documents where the FBI says, hey, FCC, can you pinpoint the location of this radio, right? And one thing they're concerned about is less so, I mean, obviously wireless radio or shortwave radios in consulates is one thing they're trying to monitor, but that's all coded. They're also trying to monitor propaganda broadcasts coming coming in from across the border with Mexico. The Germans actually do have radio stations down there that have the capability of broadcasting into Texas and places like that. So the FCC tries to jam some of those signals. The other interesting thing about German intelligence in this period is everyone talks about the wireless transmitters because that's all glamorous and things. Often they would just transmit messages using Western Union. They'd actually just code messages, take them to the telegraph office, and they'd be just in numeric code, and they just send them that way. And there are actually laws against intercepting Western Union messages in this period. And so when they asked people like Fritz Wiedemann, how did you transmit things to Berlin? He said, we just send them to the telegraph office. So it's not covert necessarily at all. Couldn't read it, but they're just sending it essentially through the mail or through the telegraph.
Staying to your left, halfway back, please.
Another question on Hitler's supposed friends in the U.S.
Yeah.
Do you know if I know there were several Nazi sabotage missions on U.S. territory.
Yep.
Do you know did any Hitler have any domestic help on that? I'm thinking especially about Station 42 in New York.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the big one is Operation Pastorius, which is 1942. It's 2 teams of saboteurs. One lands in Florida, one lands in Long Island. The idea is they've been trained in rudimentary sabotage. They have explosives. They have American clothing. They're very diligent to cut the German labels out and put American dry cleaning labels in there and things like that. And so their mission is to get on the beach, change clothes, bury your explosives, blend into American society, come back, dig it up, and blow up bridges, dams, critical infrastructure, things like that. It's actually a major terrorist plot. It fails because the leader of the Long Island team decides to call the FBI rather than face potential execution. And in fact, the FBI rounds up that whole ring within a few weeks, and 6 of the 8 are actually executed and buried in an anonymous grave outside of D.C. It's a big case, Operation Pastorius. You asked on local help. Absolutely. Most of those guys had either some connection to the U.S. or were themselves German-American. So it's people who had been waiters in New York City, people who had relatives here. And in one case, the guy's plan was to go back to his girlfriend and hang out with her until he was activated as a terrorist sleeper cell. So it's a very scary plot. And again, this goes to the commentary I made earlier of, a lot of historians used to think this was, it was a brown scare, it wasn't a real thing. You couldn't have embarked on an operation like that without the local nexus. Right, you couldn't have attempted something like Pastorius unless those people knew enough about the United States and had enough local ties to try to blend in. A number of them have been involved in the German-American Bund as well.
We're going to go to the center aisle here.
There was a wonderful book a few years ago by Leo Marx, Between Silk and Cyanide, that talked about code breaking by the Germans against the British SOE. Can you talk a little bit about how effective the Germans were with respect to the Polish codes that the SOE was using?
Yeah, of course. It's one of my favorite war memoirs, actually. If anyone doesn't know Between Silk and Cyanide, it's absolutely fantastic. He was serving on the home front. He is incredibly witty. His brain is amazing, slightly sexist, but it's amazing, amazing book. Yeah, so he was head of coding. He called it the deadliest of parlor games. He's got a really good line as well. The Germans weren't particularly, I can't really speak about the US, Bradley's your man, but in Britain, they were pretty ineffective, really. Agent Garbo ran, I think he had 17 Germans supplying him information around the country that he would then feed that back to to Germany. They're all fictional. He is an Allied spy who just has this fictional network. Agent Zigzag, he has a network. He's feeding information back to the Germans. Again, he is British. He's a double agent. He's working for us. There are no known spies who succeed, German, that are sent over to Britain. Some of them are picked up. And the code breaking as well, they do have our code breaking there is absolutely extraordinary. The work that Bletchley Park did, 75% female staff, many of them not just clerks and secretaries, but were the decoders, the cryptanalysts as well, were women. But they were just given job titles like translator and so on. But yeah, we're very effective. They also had their own bases, and they are trying to work on us, but pretty ineffective. They don't get a lot going the other way.
Next question is going to be to your left towards the front with Connie, please.
Sorry. This question's for Brad. A lot of the post-war literature about German intelligence in the United States just paints it as absolutely abysmal, and these are bumbling. Did they get any viable, any worthy intelligence in the United States? And did any of that come through diplomatic associations?
That's a great question. Yeah. So Nazi Germany is really bureaucratic, right? This is one of the facets of it that we often overlook. There's actually competing intelligence agencies who are all trying to vie for the same turf. So Baron von Spiegel, he's obviously in the Foreign Office, but he's also part of the Nazi regime in that sense. And so the Nazi Party has its own intelligence network. You have the Abwehr, that's military intelligence, and then you have the Nazi Party's sort of own intelligence networks. The party tries to insert its own agents into these consulates over the objections of the consul generals. And there's a great meeting that happens that the FBI surveils, either with human intelligence or electronic surveillance, where the consuls all meet in New York and say, hey, can we tell the Nazi Party to stop inserting their agents in here because they're useless and they're getting blown all the time. So the big Nazi spy rings you hear about are the Abwehr networks, military intelligence. They're pretty inept. But the Foreign Office guys, people like von Spiegel, actually say this in post-war interrogation. They told the Nazi Party, stop doing this. We have better intelligence just by living here. And so it's sort of like the line from Dr. Strangelove where the Russian ambassador knows about the doomsday device. Our source was the New York Times. And that's what they actually say is, read the newspapers and we'll just transmit the information from that. And that's going to be better intel than you can get by trying to infiltrate the Navy base because there's a free press.
We're going to go towards the back to your right, please.
Hi, this question is for Claire. I don't know if you can answer this question, but why wasn't Maurice Buckmaster removed from his position after the destruction of the Prosper Network, even though code words were given out by the agents saying they had been compromised?
Yeah, I mean, it's still, the whole betrayal there is very much debated. It's a live issue still, in fact, today. So Maurice Buckmaster was the head of SOE's F section, so that's the French section, had no contact with Zoe or the Polish story I've been telling today. But there are a lot of examples of his weaknesses in post. So he sent out agents like Norin Yekhan. When her wireless set was taken off, she was arrested. The Germans played a game of sort of cat and mouse, sending information, pretending it's from her, to send out various other agents. Now, she didn't use, they had a true code and a bluff code to say whether they'd been captured or not. They used the true code, but they didn't use the bluff code because they weren't NOR. He ignored that. Various people were saying to him, you know, she's not done the right security checks. We can't, this is compromised, we can't use it. He just went with it, overruled them, sent agents out. They were collected and arrested on arrival. You know, this is a man who made, that's just one example, numerous errors. Prosper, that whole area is still live. But again, looks like very difficult calls were made quite poorly. I mean, sadly, I never got to interview him, but I interviewed several of the people that worked alongside him, and they were saying, look, he was the head of the largest section of SOE in France, considerably the margin at the largest. And this has never been done before. He is breaking boundaries. They are taking risks the whole time. He made some bad calls, but overall the results were magnificent. So you have to give this some sort of leeway. There was collateral damage, but there are other calls he made that were right, that made big impact. I find him a really difficult character, and I know a friend of mine is working on a book in that area, but I can't place the call on that particular question right now.
Next question is in the center aisle, a little to your right, please.
Hello, Claire. It was a brilliant talk that you did today, and your brilliant talk yesterday. My question is twofold. First of all, do you know where the hotel is in Paris that Agent Zoe was? Is it still there? And do you have any plans for more brilliant books? Because your book is excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. I like that question. I couldn't see who called it. Was that Jo? No, because she's a tour guide, and so she'd be asking about where the hotel is. We don't have the name of the hotel, but we know it was near a particular metro station, so it might be possible to work it out. I didn't actually get that detail. We know where a number of the women were kept. We know where Avenue Foch is. We know exactly the cell where Nor was, and so on. So there's a lot of information in the area, but we don't have the name of the hotel that Zoe was sent to. The other book, am I doing more books? I am under contract now to do another book. I've got 4 books. There's an extraordinary story about, we were talking about there's not enough stories of what was happening inside the Axis. So I've got a book on the only 2 women who served as test pilots for the Third Reich, one of whom was a fanatical Nazi and tried to save Hitler's life. The other one was secretly part Jewish in the resistance and tried to kill him. There's only 2 women in this role. It's amazing. I'm answering it by talking about a past book because I haven't finished chapter 1 of the next one, which I'm extremely excited about. It's something rather different again, but it's too early for me to talk about yet. Thank you.
We have time for one last quick question. It's going to be to your right with Connie, please.
Great presentation. 2 questions, 2 quick questions. When Agent Zoe jumped from the train, did she have the money with her, or did she just jump without the money? And the second question was, you said she was sentenced to 10 years. Did she do the whole 10 years?
Yeah, both good questions. If I'd have had more time, I'd have told you about the money. One of the first things she does when she realizes that Clara has been arrested is she manages to stow that very battered but incredibly precious now suitcase in the left luggage station lockers, and she takes a ticket for it, and she manages to pass that on to what we call a drop box, a dead drop box, so a place where she knows the resistance will pick up the ticket for it so they can get the money. So the money is safe. She doesn't have to jump from the train with it. So she's already taken care of that. What was the second one again?
Did she
How
serve
long
the
did she
10
serve?
years?
Oh, yeah, her serving, yeah. So they arrested her on horrible trumped-up charges. They did torture her rather horrifically. But she only served 6 years. She was quite damaged in her time there. But she became a beacon for resistance inside the prisons. There were a lot of young women. She was held in a women's prison. Most of the women were younger than her. And she set up education in there to sort of keep their morale going. And suicide rates went right down when she was in there. Amazing to interview one of those women who were there. But after Stalin died, there was a bit of a thaw, and she was released after 6 years. But she was arrested again a second time in 1976 on Operation Historian. She was under surveillance. She was harassed. They prevented her from having, she did set up the Polish equivalent of the Open University, so long-distance learning. She's amazing. But they harass her, and eventually she had a heart attack. Her career was completely ruined by them. But she kept fighting. What she did was she interviewed everyone from the war because she realized that the communist narrative was completely different to the narrative we understand of the Second World War. They actually call it the Great Patriotic War, and it starts in 1941. I know the American War starts in 1941, but they disregard anything inconvenient of them being actually Hitler's main ally at the start of the war. That's never mentioned. It starts when they join the Allies. And so she rewrote the narrative, and she kept thousands of testimonies of interviews with veterans. And this archive is one of the most important in Poland now. So she was still continuing her work.
Ladies and gentlemen, Leah Garrett, Clare Mulley, and Bradley Hart. Thank you to our panelists. Leah and Clare and Bradley will all be outside at the book signing table. We have a few books left of Leah's and Clare's, and unfortunately, Leah's going to be leaving us soon today, so you better get them signed now. We will have a just under 30-minute break, and we will be back at 10:15 for our next session. Thank you very much.